Most people think poverty begins in the bank account, but that is never where it starts. It begins much earlier, much quieter, in places people never think to guard. I know this, because I spent years mapping those entry points, sitting in rooms where the goal was not to make people poor overnight, but to make poverty feel normal, explainable, even spiritual. When you understand that, you realize why so many hardworking, praying, disciplined Christians still feel like they are running on a treadmill that never moves forward. They tithe, they fast, they declare scriptures, they rebuke devourers, yet something invisible keeps draining momentum. What you are about to hear is not theory, not speculation, and not a sermon illustration. It is a system I helped build, monitor, and refine. And if you stay with me, you will recognize it operating in places you never suspected, especially in moments that feel harmless, cultural, even comforting. That realization alone is why many people will never hear this message, and why those who do will never look at certain daily habits the same way again. When I first entered the Dark Kingdom as operational structure, I believed the lie most recruits are given, that we were fighting belief systems, attacking doctrine, trying to turn people away from God. That narrative is useful for beginners, but it is not how real influence is executed. You don't fight faith head-on. You redirect behavior quietly. You don't stop people from praying. You teach them to pray while unknowingly reinforcing the very systems they are praying against. That is where the real victories happen, and that is where food comes in. Food crosses boundaries sermons cannot. It enters homes without resistance. It is shared during celebrations, stress, grief, and bonding. It is repeated daily, sometimes multiple times a day, which makes it one of the most powerful carriers of agreement in existence. Most people think agreements require intention. That misunderstanding has cost generations. Before I go any further, I need to say this clearly, especially if this channel is new to you. If you want to understand what is actually planned, normalized, and deployed against believers at a systemic level, you need to stay connected. Not because I am here to scare you, but because ignorance has always been the Dark Kingdom's favorite ally. Subscribe, not out of loyalty to me, but because there are things being done quietly that most churches never address. And once you see them, you can unsee them. Every message here is designed so you never reacting late to strategies that have been running for decades. My role was not ceremonial. I was not standing in dark rooms chanting. I was a strategist. I worked with behavioral data, cultural trends, and long-term outcome tracking. One of the departments I eventually led focused on what we called daily reinforcements. These were practices that did not look evil, did not feel dangerous, and would never trigger spiritual alarms. Food practices were at the top of that list because they accomplished three things simultaneously. They bypass discernment, they condition repetition, and they create shared participation. When something is shared, it multiplies its effect. When it is repeated, it deepens. When it is normalized, it becomes invisible. That invisibility is the real door. I remember one early assignment that changed how I understood poverty forever. We were sent into a region with a high density of churches, strong worship culture, and consistent charitable giving. On paper, this region should have been economically stable. Spiritually active communities tend to support one another, but the data showed stagnation. Businesses struggled to scale. Families lived paycheck to paycheck despite education and effort. Our task was not to create the problem, it was already present. Our task was to understand what was feeding it. What we discovered was not a lack of prayer or generosity. It was something much closer to home, something repeated weekly, sometimes daily, something taught as tradition and convenience. This is where most people misunderstand how the Dark Kingdom operates. We don't need you to believe in us. We don't need you to fear us. Fear is noisy and unstable. What we need is your participation without awareness. The most effective systems are the ones people defend. When someone defends a habit emotionally, spiritually, or culturally, they reinforce it harder than any external force ever could. Food is deeply emotional. It carries memory, identity, and belonging. That is why it is guarded so poorly. No one expects an attack there. And because no one expects it, no one resists it. I worked with a colleague, brilliant mind, extremely disciplined. His assignment was to oversee what we internally called harmless cycles. His job was not to invent anything new, but to amplify what already existed. He used timing, marketing, and social reinforcement. Certain foods were encouraged during specific emotional states: stress, celebration, exhaustion, reward. Over time, those foods became anchors. People did just eat them. They associated them with relief, bonding, and identity. What most never realized is that anchors are agreements. When you return to the same thing in the same emotional state over and over, you are not just consuming. You are consenting. Here's the part that unsettles most Christians when they finally see it. We never needed them to stop believing in God. In fact, strong belief often made the system more effective. because suffering was spiritualized instead of investigated. God is testing us. This is a season. Breakthrough is coming. Those phrases are not wrong, but they become dangerous when they are used to explain patterns that require awareness, not endurance. The Dark Kingdom thrives where discernment is replaced with denial. Food practices were chosen carefully, not exotic rituals, not forbidden substances. Everyday items. Things passed down through families. Things tied to comfort and culture. When a practice is inherited, people stop questioning it. And when people stop questioning, cycles form. Poverty rarely arrives as lack. It arrives as leakage. A little motivation drained here. A little clarity dulled there. A little discipline eroded over time. Multiply that by years. Then generations, and suddenly poverty feels inherited, not imposed. I can already feel some resistance rising in you, and that's normal. When something touches daily life, the mind rushes to defend it. That defense is exactly what we counted on. We used to say, internally, if they get offended, we've already won half the battle. Offense shuts down curiosity. Curiosity is the enemy of hidden systems. So let me slow this down and say this carefully. The power was never in the food itself. It was in the pattern surrounding it, the timing, the emotional state, the repetition, the lack of awareness. That combination opens doors quietly, not dramatically. One of my later missions involved auditing long-term outcomes. We tracked families over decades, same prayers, same church attendance, same generosity, but consistent financial instability. When we overlaid behavioral data, the patterns were undeniable. The same food-related practices appeared at moments of stress and decision fatigue. After work, after church, after conflict, after exhaustion, moments when discernment is lowest. That is not accidental. Nothing about this system is accidental. This is also why simply stopping something without understanding it rarely works. When people try to break free without awareness, they replace one unconscious pattern with another. That is why resolutions fail. That is why cycles repeat. Awareness is what collapses the agreement. When someone sees the pattern, truly sees it, the system loses leverage. I watched entire operations fall apart because one household became conscious and changed how they engaged daily habits. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. If I were in your position, hearing this for the first time, I would rush to change anything yet. I would observe. I would watch when certain foods appear. I would notice emotional states. I would pay attention to patterns that repeat without thought. That alone begins to weaken what was designed to operate unseen. The Dark Kingdom is not threatened by loud declarations. It is threatened by quiet awareness. There was a point near the end of my time inside when metrics stopped making sense. Regions that should have remained stagnant began to shift. Not because of new teachings, not because of dramatic revivals, but because people became intentional about everyday life. That terrified leadership more than any altar call ever could. When habits are examined, systems unravel. I am telling you all of this not to overwhelm you, but to prepare you. What you are about to understand goes deeper than food. Food is just one door, but it is one of the most effective. And once you see how that door works, you will recognize others instantly. That is why staying connected matters. Subscribe so you don't, to encounter these realities after they've already done their work. The goal is not fear. The goal is clarity. And clarity always puts you a step ahead of systems designed to keep you running in place. There is one detail I haven't explained yet, and it is the detail that makes everything you've heard so far click into place. It's not what people eat. It is when, why, and how often they return to it without thought. That is where the real agreement forms. And once you understand that, you will realize why this system has survived for so long without being named, challenged, or dismantled. Once you understand that timing and repetition are the true engines behind these systems, everything else starts to make uncomfortable sense. Inside the Dark Kingdom, we rarely talked about good and evil the way people imagine. We talked about access, sustainability, and compliance. A system is only successful if it can run without maintenance. The moment something requires constant reinforcement, it becomes fragile. That is why the most effective strategies were always the ones people maintain themselves, proudly, defensively, even spiritually. Food-based practices were perfect for this because they were self-reinforcing, no reminders needed, no enforcement required. People returned to them willingly, often gratefully, never realizing what they were reinforcing underneath. I remember sitting in a closed session where senior planners reviewed what they called low-resistance gateways. These were not sins in the traditional sense. They were habits, rhythms, things no pastor would warn against because they didn't look like rebellion. In fact, many of them looked like rest, reward, or bonding. One of the senior analysts said something that stayed with me long after I left. If you want to control outcomes, touch belief. Touch behavior when belief is tired. That sentence explains more about modern spiritual warfare than most books ever will. The food practice at the center of this discussion was never introduced aggressively. It did need to be. It already existed in culture. Our job was to make it frequent, emotional, and justified. Stress justification was the most effective. People under pressure crave relief, not discipline. When exhaustion meets convenience, discernment is the first thing to leave the room. That is not a mortal failure. It has human biology. We studied that carefully. We knew exactly when people would default to autopilot. That autopilot is where agreements are formed. What most people don't realize is that poverty in the Dark Kingdom's framework is not primarily about money. Money is a symptom. Poverty is about narrowing options. It is about reducing margin. It is about keeping people too tired, too distracted, or too foggy to make long-term decisions. When margin disappears, everything becomes reactive. Reactive people are easy to manage. They don't plan, they cope. They don't build, they survive. And survival feels spiritual when you were told it, as noble. There was a family we tracked for years, not because they were exceptional, but because they were typical, faithful, kind, hardworking. Every financial breakthrough seemed to slip through their fingers, unexpected expenses, missed opportunities, chronic burnout. When we overlaid behavioral data, the pattern was clear. Certain food choices appeared consistently at moments of depletion. Light nights, emotional stress, post-conflict. Those choices were followed by lethargy, reduced focus, and short-term thinking. No dramatic collapse, just enough erosion to delay progress again and again. That delay is the real win. Delay breeds discouragement. Discouragement breeds resignation. Resignation looks like humility from the outside. Inside the system, we celebrated delay far more than destruction. Destruction is loud and provokes intervention. Delay is quiet and self-sustaining. Food practices that produce mental fog, emotional dependency, or physical sluggishness were ideal because their effects could always be explained away. I am just tired. It's been a long week. I deserve this. Those phrases were music to our ears, not because the food was evil, but because the pattern was unconscious. There was another colleague of mine, younger, ambitious, extremely effective. His specialty was cultural camouflage. He understood how to embed systems so deeply that questioning them felt like rejecting your own identity. He once said, if they defend it emotionally, they'll never examine it spiritually. His mission involved linking certain food practices to family tradition and spiritual bonding. Once that link was formed, resistance became nearly impossible. Any attempt to question the practice felt like an attack on heritage, love, or unity. That emotional shield protected the system perfectly. Here's something that may surprise you. We avoided overt excess. Excess triggers guilt. Guilt triggers repentance. Repentance disrupts patterns. Moderation was far more useful. Just enough. Often enough. Consistently enough. The goal was never indulgence, it was dependency. Not addiction in the clinical sense, but emotional reliance. When relief becomes external and automatic, internal regulation weakens. That weakness shows up everywhere: finances, discipline, relationships, vision. The spiritual component was subtle but deliberate. Certain foods were positioned as rewards after spiritual effort, after church, after fasting, after volunteering. That created a loop where discipline was always followed by depletion. Over time, people associated obedience with exhaustion instead of empowerment. That association quietly reshaped expectation. Faith became something that drained rather than strengthened. Once that belief takes hold, people stop expecting abundance. They expect survival. We monitored language closely. Language reveals internal alignment. When people began saying things like, this is just how it is, or money always comes and goes, we knew the system was working. Acceptance is more powerful than oppression. Accepted limitations are rarely challenged. Food practices that reinforced low energy and short-term comfort accelerated that acceptance. Again, no demons, no rituals, no obvious darkness. Just habits running on autopilot. I want to pause here and say something important, because misunderstanding this is where many people go wrong. None of this means food is the enemy. The Dark Kingdom does need enemies, it needs patterns. The same item consumed consciously, intentionally, and occasionally does not carry the same effect as something consumed reflexively, emotionally, and repeatedly. The power was never in the object. It was in the unconscious return. That is why banning things never works. Awareness does. Toward the end of my time inside, I was tasked with reviewing failing regions. These were areas where poverty cycles were breaking unexpectedly. What we found was fascinating and deeply troubling to leadership. People hadn't changed their beliefs. They hadn't left their churches. They hadn't become extreme. They had simply become intentional. They paid attention to their habits. They noticed when they were reaching for comfort instead of clarity. That pause, that single moment of awareness, disrupted years of conditioning. One household in particular stands out. Nothing dramatic happened. No visions, no confrontations. The parents simply decided to observe their routines without judgment. They noticed patterns tied to stress and exhaustion. They adjusted timing, not out of fear, but out of stewardship. Within months, their energy improved, decisions improved, financial conversations shifted from reactive to strategic. That ripple effect spread quietly. Quiet ripples are dangerous to hidden systems because they don't announce themselves. Inside the Dark Kingdom, there was a saying, if they ever connect their habits to their outcomes, we lose leverage. That connection is exactly what this conversation is designed to create, not condemnation. Connection. When you see how small, repeated choices shape long-term realities, you stop fighting shadows and start reclaiming ground. If I were still in that system and someone shared this information publicly, I know exactly what the response would be. Discredit, mock, reduce it to superstition. Anything to keep people from looking too closely at their daily lives. Because once people look, really look, the illusion breaks. And illusions are the backbone of sustainable control. This is why staying engaged matters. Not because you need constant warnings, but because awareness fades if it is not reinforced. Patterns reassert themselves when attention drifts. Subscribe not out of fear, but out of discipline. Staying informed keeps you from slipping back into autopilot. Autopilot is where these systems thrive. There is still one layer we haven't touched yet, and it's the layer that makes this even more relevant to Christians specifically. It has to do with how spiritual language is used to justify physical depletion, and how that depletion quietly undermines stewardship, dominion, and legacy. When you see how that layer works, you will understand why this strategy has been so effective for so long, and why breaking it does require panic, just clarity and consistency. The layer most believers never examine is how spiritual language can be used to anesthetize physical wisdom. Inside the Dark Kingdom, we studied Scripture as carefully as any seminary student, not to refute it, but to learn how it was commonly misapplied. One of the most effective distortions was separating the spiritual from the physical, as if God only cared about prayer while habits were neutral territory. That separation created a blind spot large enough to hide entire systems. When physical depletion was framed as spiritual virtue, resistance disappeared. People stopped asking whether their daily rhythm supported the life they were praying for. I remember a briefing where a senior strategist explained it in a way that unsettled even some of us. He said, if obedience always feels draining, they will eventually lower their expectations of reward. That sentence became a guiding principle. We observed how believers often poured themselves out endlessly while neglecting restoration that required intention rather than indulgence. Food practices were positioned as quick restoration, but quick restoration is rarely true restoration. It dulls instead of renews. Over time, dullness becomes normal and normal becomes invisible. There was a particular operation where we focused on leaders rather than congregations, not to attack them directly, but to exhaust them subtly. Leaders under constant depletion make short-term decisions. Short-term decisions create unstable systems. Unstable systems keep people busy surviving instead of building. The food-related habits encouraged in those environments were framed as convenience and reward. Late nights followed by heavy, fog-inducing meals. Celebrations that left everyone sluggish instead of strengthened. Again, nothing dramatic. Just enough to keep clarity slightly out of reach. One of my coworkers ran an analysis comparing communities with similar faith intensity but different daily habits. The difference in long-term outcomes was staggering. The communities that treated food and rest as stewardship rather than entitlement consistently showed better financial planning, stronger family structures, and clearer vision. That terrified leadership because it meant the system was not invincible. It relied entirely on conscious participation. Once participation became conscious, control evaporated. What made this strategy especially effective against Christians was their deep trust. Trust in God is powerful, but misplaced trust in habits can be devastating. Many believe that if something was explicitly sinful, it did require examination. That assumption allowed patterns to grow unchecked. We exploited that gap relentlessly, not by introducing darkness, but by amplifying neglect. There was a man I worked alongside for years, highly respected internally. His specialty was long-term erosion. He didn't believe in dramatic collapse. He believed in slow dulling. His most successful missions lasted decades and never made headlines. Families stayed intact. Churches stayed open. Prayers continued, but legacy stalled. Vision narrowed. Dreams became unrealistic. He once told me, if they ever feel content with survival, we've succeeded. That contentment was always reinforced through comfort habits, especially food tied to emotional relief. Here is something most people, 1, tell you comfort is not neutral. Comfort sought intentionally can restore. Comfort sought reflexively can enslave. The Dark Kingdom thrived on reflex. We never needed people to choose destruction. We only needed them to choose relief without awareness. Relief feels good. Relief feels deserved. Relief feels harmless. That is why it is dangerous when it becomes automatic. I began to question everything when I noticed how often strategies relied on exhaustion, not moral failure. Exhaustion. Exhausted people don't rebel. They comply. They don't dream. They cope. They don't ask hard questions. They accept explanations that would never satisfy them if they were rested and clear. Food practices that spiked and crashed energy were perfect for maintaining that state. The crash always came later, far enough removed that people never connected cause and effect. There was a season when I was asked to mentor newer operatives. One of them was frustrated. He wanted faster results. He wanted visible impact. I told him something I had learned the hard way. If they are still praying but no longer expecting, you are doing it right. That sentence haunted me after I left. Expectation is dangerous to hidden systems. Expectation demands alignment. Without alignment, patterns are exposed. When I eventually stepped away, it was because of a single moment, but because I could no longer ignore how reversible everything was. The system looked powerful only because people did. No, they were participating. Once awareness entered, even slightly, the machinery began to grind. I saw households reclaim margin simply by adjusting rhythms, not becoming extreme, not becoming fearful, just becoming intentional. That intentionality restored energy. Energy restored clarity. Clarity restored vision. Vision changed outcomes. If I were standing where you are now, I would feel afraid. I would feel alert. I would start noticing when spiritual language is used to excuse physical neglect. I would question narratives that glorify depletion without restoration. I would examine habits that promise relief but deliver fog, not to condemn them, but to understand them. Understanding is where freedom begins. There was a moment during an internal review when leadership admitted something quietly, almost reluctantly. They said, our biggest risk is informed believers, not rebellious ones, not angry ones, informed ones. People who connect daily habits to long-term fruit are extremely difficult to manipulate. They don't panic. They don't overreact. They simply stop feeding what drains them. This is why sharing this matters, not because everyone needs the same changes, but because everyone needs awareness. Systems collapse when awareness spreads. That is why I keep urging you to stay connected. Subscribe so you don't lose sight of what you begun to see. Awareness is not a one-time event. It as a posture. There is still one final piece that completes this picture. It as the part that answers the question most people are already forming. How to disengage from these systems without becoming obsessive, fearful, or extreme. The answer is simpler than most expect and far more powerful than dramatic resistance. Once you understand that final piece, you'll realize the Dark Kingdom never feared prayer. It feared alignment. Alignment is the word that dismantles everything you've heard so far and puts it back together correctly. Inside the Dark Kingdom, we understood alignment as the moment when belief, behavior, and expectation move in the same direction. As long as those three are misaligned, systems run smoothly. People can believe one thing, do another, and expect a third, and the friction between them produces exhaustion. Exhaustion produces compliance. But when alignment appears, even quietly, leverage disappears almost instantly. That is why awareness was always treated as a threat, not prayer, not fasting, not worship. Alignment changes outcomes without noise. The mistake many people make when they first become aware of hidden systems is swinging toward fear or extremes. That reaction actually helps the Dark Kingdom because extremes are unstable. They burn out, they isolate, they draw attention to the wrong things. What dismantles long-running systems is calm, consistent, unglorified alignment. The kind that does announce itself. The kind that simply stops participating in patterns that no longer serve life, clarity, or stewardship. I watch people try to fight these systems with force. They would cut everything at once, impose rigid rules, shame themselves for past habits. Those efforts rarely lasted. Shame is a terrible motivator. It creates pressure, not wisdom. Pressure seeks release, and release often returns people to the same habits they were trying to escape. The Dark Kingdom counted on that cycle. Guilt followed by relapse reinforced the belief that change was impossible. That belief alone kept many trapped longer than any habit ever could. What actually worked, over and over again, was something far less dramatic. People began asking better questions. Not, is this evil? But what does this produce over time? Not, do I deserve this? But what state does this reinforce? Those questions bypass moral panic and go straight to stewardship. Stewardship is dangerous to hidden systems because it reframes choice. When people see themselves as stewards rather than victims or rebels, They reclaim authority quietly. One of the last internal reports I reviewed before leaving detailed why certain regions were no longer responding to intervention. The conclusion was blunt. People had stopped medicating exhaustion and started addressing it. They weren't chasing comfort. They were protecting clarity. That single shift disrupted years of conditioning. When clarity returns, people notice opportunities they used to miss. They plan instead of react. They delay gratification without resentment. Those are not spiritual fireworks, but they change everything. I think about a couple I observed near the end. They never knew they were being monitored, and they did need to. They simply grew tired of feeling tired. Instead of asking God why provision felt hard, they examined their rhythms. They adjusted when and how they sought relief. They treated food as fuel and fellowship, not anesthesia. Over time, their energy stabilized. Their conversations changed. Their finances followed. No miracle checks, no sudden windfalls, just steady progress. That kind of progress is almost impossible to stop once it starts. Inside the Dark Kingdom, we had contingency plans for almost everything. Economic shifts, cultural movements, political changes. What we never solved was what to do when people became quietly aligned. Aligned people don't argue much. They don't announce changes. They simply stop feeding what drains them. Systems starve when participation ends. That is not dramatic. It is devastating. If you're wondering how to disengage without becoming obsessive, the answer is simpler than you think. Obsession keeps the focus on the system. Alignment shifts the focus back to life. Life grows naturally when conditions are right. You don't force it. You protect it. That protection looks like awareness in small moments, noticing when you are reaching for relief instead of rest, noticing when habits follow emotion automatically, pausing just long enough to choose intentionally. That pause is everything. There was a phrase we used internally that still echoes in my mind. They don't need less faith, they need less friction. Friction between belief and behavior drains energy. Reducing that friction restores momentum. Momentum builds margin. Margin creates options. Options are the opposite of poverty. Poverty thrives where options are limited. Restore options, and the entire structure weakens. This is why I've been careful throughout this conversation not to tell you what to eat or what to ban. Prescriptions create dependence. Awareness creates autonomy. Autonomy is dangerous to any system that relies on unconscious participation. Once you understand the mechanics, you can apply them anywhere, not just with food. You will start seeing patterns in spending, scheduling, rest, even spiritual routines. The same principles apply everywhere. One of the final meetings I attended before leaving was tense. Leadership was concerned. Data showed a slow but undeniable shift. People were no longer predictable. Habits were changing without campaigns, without messaging, without pressure. Someone said almost in frustration they were becoming hard to manage. That sentence revealed everything. The goal was never destruction, it was management. When management fails, control dissolves. I want you to notice something important about how this ends. There is no dramatic confrontation, no enemy to chase, no ritual to perform. Just clarity, consistency, and stewardship. That may feel anticlimactic, but it's the truth. The Dark Kingdom does not fear loud resistance. It fears quiet disengagement. When people stop feeding patterns unconsciously, systems collapse under their own weight. At this point, you know more than most people ever will about how everyday habits intersect with long-term outcomes. You know why poverty can persist even among faithful, hardworking believers. You know why prayer alone was never meant to replace wisdom, and why faith was never meant to excuse neglect. That knowledge carries responsibility, not fear, responsibility to observe, to choose intentionally, to share awareness, not panic. This is why I keep urging you to stay connected. Not because you need constant warnings, but because alignment requires reinforcement. Life will try to pull you back into autopilot. That's normal. Stay informed helps you stay awake. Subscribe so you remain a step ahead of systems that only work when you were unaware of them. Every message here is designed to sharpen clarity, not create fear. If you share this with someone, frame it as a warning. Frame it as an invitation to awareness. Awareness empowers without condemning. It restores without shaming. It strengthens without isolating. That is the kind of shift that spreads quietly and changes outcomes generationally. The Dark Kingdom never lost because people became more aggressive. It lost because people became more aligned. Aligned with what they believe. Aligned with how they live. Aligned with what they expect. When those three move together, poverty loses its grip not because it was fought, but because it was no longer fed.